probably what you're noticing is the use of a comma splice. That is, since there's nothing wrong with beginning a sentence with however, your peeve probably consists of the person not putting a full stop at all the material before the however. So this is the comma splice that, or some comma fault, or that I'll confess I'm sympathetic. It drives me crazy as well. However, I'm always wary of the phrase, "I've noticed that recently," because if you actually look it up, most things that people notice recently are not recent. And one can verify this either with, by going to the style books of a couple of decades ago, and you'll find the same complaints. Or now, more recently, you can actually check it more objectively by going to the Google Ngram Viewer, where you can search a text string up to 5 words long in 200 words of digitized English books. Most contemporary complaints actually go way back. Now, your question is, the fact that you notice it and it's found, does it mean that it will take over and become standard? And the answer is not necessarily. So in a process that I don't think anyone really understands, it may be as capricious as other cultural changes like fashion and clothing. Some novel usages that are perceived as errors take over and become unexceptionable. They reach a tipping point, so to speak, like to contact, and hopefully is almost all the way there. Others, the preferred usage stands its ground for long stretches of time. So in the early 1960s, when the so-called usage wars began, or the grammar wars, because of the publication of a allegedly descriptive American dictionary, Webster's Third, there was a prediction by the literary critic Dwight MacDonald that by 1988, the dictionaries would accept mischievous, invidious, and nuclear as a pronunciation of nuclear. Because if you acknowledge that these errors exist, then the floodgates open, the ramparts are overrun, and the language deteriorates. Well, he made that prediction in 1963. Well, it's not just 25 years later, it's 50 years later. And I looked it up, and there's no dictionary that has mischievous, invidious, or nuclear. It is, even though there are some cases where resistance is futile, there are other cases in which you can go ahead and continue to stickle, and probably the majority of literate readers may continue to be on your side 50 years from now. We don't know. I don't know if the comma splice, which by the way is what irks you, has been common in a lot of English writing before there was something of a crackdown. Whether we'll go back to the comma splice, I don't know. I tend to doubt it. But let's see. And is there anyone? Okay. Yes. Yeah. Yes.
Just sort of that a good writer may flaunt the rules as long as they're aware of the rules and do so consciously, which sounds very reasonable. Now, if I think about the visual arts, there's rules in visual art, and artists may flaunt those consciously, like somebody like Picasso obviously has done so, but there's also a concept of outsider art or naive art, which is still considered to be good, even though it doesn't follow the rules and isn't aware of the rules. Do you think there's room for a concept like that in writing?
Oh, absolutely. And indeed, Joyce was an early example, but more, and in many forms of experimental fiction, even more flagrantly in poetry. Again, going back to Joyce, it's really not a question of that the rules are inviolable, just that they're relative to the goal of the writer. Most of the time, a writer is trying to be experimental, really wants to meet the expectations of a literate readership, wants to be clear, and so the resources of language make that possible if they're thoughtfully applied. But absolutely, E.E. Cummings, when it came to capitalization, for example, another considered radical in its era, now kind of conventional, but sure. Oh, you're beckoning over to, we have a question. Oh, yes, Oliver Cam. ironically self-described pedant of the Times.
I'm Oliver Cam, I'm language columnist of the Times. Steve, you argue very forcefully, very brilliantly, that the idea that standards of language are declining is false, and it's been heard in, as you say, literally every generation since the invention of the printing press. What do you make of the idea? Is there any sense to the idea that standards of language are improving? I'm thinking of the argument of Otto Jespersen, the great Danish scholar of English grammar, that language moves to maximum expressiveness, and the more recent argument of Noam Chomsky that language is perfect. From what I know of your writings and our discussions, I suspect you would disagree with that, but perhaps you could comment on it.
Yeah. I think it's a hard question to answer because there's no such thing as language. There are languages used in so many different ways by so many different people for so many different purposes that that it's actually an error to talk about the language. And that's one of the reasons why I don't subscribe to the idea that, say, Twitter is forcing us to think shorter thoughts, because all of us, each individual, uses language in a variety of forms, and depending on the context. You speak differently to your spouse or your kids over the breakfast table than you do if you were delivering a funeral oration or if you were speaking on the BBC. And Twitter is just one of many registers or forms of language. And so to ask the question, is language as a whole getting more expressive? There are just too many different ways in which it's being used. One could ask the question of, say in the language used in newspapers, even then different newspapers have slightly different styles and tones. So I don't think it's getting worse in that. I don't think the best. Maybe that would be a kind of benchmark.
But we are all writing more, aren't we?
And we are all writing more. Who would have thought, those of us who lived through the 60s, 70s, and 80s, that the use of the telephone would be declining, or watching broadcast television? People are spending more time in the world of text than in the visual and auditory world. And of course, several decades ago, the Cassandras were lamenting the decline of civilization because no one was reading anymore. They were spending all their time on the phone and watching TV. Now, the complaints are everyone's at their keyboard. So yes, I think text, one could argue, is more important than ever.
You should take someone from the balcony.
Ah, yes. Thank you.
Oh, hi there. I was really interested in this difficult dilemma between he and she, sort of gender literacy. And I noticed in your presentation, and given that you're talking about the visual picture of conveying empathically a story to the audience, that twice, and I'm not a feminist, but I just noticed that twice you referred to reader as she and writer as he. And I'm interested. Sitting down, I did notice you used he or she, and it struck me because in the things that I do, I have to stumble around, being not only politically correct, but making sure that I'm conveying truthfully what I'm trying to say, and have this dilemma of he and she, and it's very clumsy. So I was just curious how you feel it's best to handle that.
Yes.
In that the old-fashioned way of just using man, he, is the generic for all of us.
Yes.
Has passed by.
Yeah, it's one of many cases in which the resources of the English language just aren't up to the demands of writers and communication. So it's a case, to get back to Oliver Cam's question, where the language quite flagrantly is not perfect, very far from being perfect, because there is no way to refer to a generic individual without making some kind of trade-off. Now, there are a number of options facing a writer. The one that I personally used in the book was to alternate in chapters between having the generic writer being consistently he and the generic reader consistently she, and the other way around. And fortunately, I have an even number of chapters. But there are...
Did you design it that way for that reason, partly? Did you design it that way?
I designed it that way. That was the choice that I made, and I explained it in one of the book's few footnotes, that's what I was doing. But I also discuss explicitly the array of options facing the writer. One of them is the much reviled but historically respectable so-called singular they. Everyone return to their seats. No American should be under a cloud of suspicion because of what they look like. And getting back to Jane Austen, there is I cited a paper called Everyone Loves Their Jane Austen, which went through her oeuvre and counted the number of times she used singular they, and I believe it was 57. And not just in the speech of her characters, but in the speech of the narrator. So Jane Austen had no problem with it. And I think that is one of the respectable options. It is not, it is neither illiterate in the sense of contradicting the best practices of English writers, nor illogical, because the they in Everyone Return to Their Seats is actually not in fact plural when you look at its semantics. It is basically, its meaning is a bound variable. It is what a logician would paraphrase as, for all x, x returned to x's seat, the meaning of they is x. And so semantically, it's perfectly respectable. There are contexts in which it would clearly pop out and distract the reader. If you have, say, a person should watch their language. If the singular and the they are too close, then that just clashes too much, and you might want to use another option of converting to the plural. People should watch their language. That's another option. Can also be imperfect, because sometimes you really need to line up in one-to-one correspondence the different clauses that involve an individual. Sometimes you may have no choice but to say he or she, and as long as it isn't done too much and the sentence doesn't have too many of them, it can pass unnoticed. But the option that is no longer available is to use the masculine to refer to a generic member of the species. And one of the, it used to be said that English, like other languages, the he is ambiguous between masculine and neuter, and that's just false. It is just not true of English. He is unmistakably masculine. If you say something like, Jack and his sister had a game, who could find uglier pictures of himself? That just doesn't work. Him is masculine. And when you read, the original objections to non-sexist language are that it pops out and it seems like the reader is boasting, look what a sensitive, new age, non-sexist guy I am, if you use, say, she, when formerly readers would expect he. Interestingly, in the 40 years since the feminist revolution, that reflexive reaction has been turned on its head. And when I read articles from the 1960s, say, in political theory, that say, in a just society, every man should be free to express his opinion without being encumbered by other men, I do a double take, since, well, gee, what about the women? And so our intuitions have changed as they had with contact, as they are doing with hopefully, and one is faced with an imperfect set of choices, each of which has advantages and disadvantages, none of which is perfect. And there's a more, I guess, a general point that I'll make is that when it comes to issues of usage, the great fallacy is that this is a matter of objective reality, and that there is a clear-cut correct and an incorrect way to express oneself. I think that matters of usage and diction and grammar must be matters of judgment, like criticism, like reviewing, like making sense of an unruly literature. A writer has to make choices, just mindful of what the options are and what the advantages and disadvantages are of each.